Australia is the place that is today because between 1788 and 1850, 162,000 convicts were sent here as a solution to overcrowding in British prisons. So this video is going to be a bit of a breakdown of why I will not celebrate the 26th of January. Alright, first of all, let's get this straight. This guy, he's the one that rocked up on the 26th of January 1788 and claimed it for the Brits. This guy was already dead when that happened, and despite what the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison may tell you, Cook did not circumnavigate Australia. That was this guy, Flinders. And I'd like to quickly give a warning to any Aboriginal members of the audience that we are going to be discussing some pretty distressing stuff in this video. And I'd also like to say that this should be distressing to everybody that watches it. Alright, I'm going to start off by reading from alrc.gov.au, which is the Australian Law Reform Commission. And I would just like to note that written on the site are terms that are outdated, insensitive, insulting, but where it may be written, I will not be saying it, I will be substituting it. I just want to make a note of that. The 18th of August 2010, the settled colony debate, the distinction between settled and conquered colonies. A more usual, though not necessarily more fruitful approach to the question of common law recognition of customary law is through a reassessment of the way in which the basic common law rules with respect to the colonial acquisition were applied to Australia in 1788 and thereafter. It has been argued that such a reassessment would open the way to wider recognition of customary laws by the common law. It is clear that these rules were the vehicle by which recognition of Aboriginal laws were denied. From the first days of settlement, the interaction of the British administration policies and legal principles relating to the colonies provided the foundation for asserting of English law at the expense of customary laws and practices of Aboriginal groups. The general principle for the introduction of English law into a settled as distinct from conquered colony were laid down by Blackstone in 1765. Blackstone is this guy, William Blackstone, and he's probably most known for writing the commentaries on the laws of England. Alright. And continuing reading from the site, Justice Blackburn in Milpram's case put the distinction thus: there is a distinction between settled colonies, where the land being desert and uncultivated is claimed by right of occupancy, and conquered or ceded colonies. The words desert and uncultivated are Blackstone's own. They have always been taken to include territory in which live uncivilized inhabitants in a primitive state of society. The difference between the laws of the two kinds of colonies is that those of the former kind, all the English laws which are applicable to the colony are immediately enforced thereupon its foundation. In those of the latter kind, the colony already having laws of its own that remain in force until altered. As the Privy Council. Oh wait, what do you mean Privy Council, you say? Well, you're in the right place. According to the Parliament of UK's website, the Privy Council is an advisory board to the monarch. Its members are known as Privy Councillors. It is one of the oldest parts of the UK's constitutional arrangements, with its origins dating back to at least the 13th century. Okay, back to alrc.gov.au. As the Privy Council pointed out in passing in Cooper v Stewart, New South Wales had been regarded as a tract of territory practically unoccupied without settled inhabitants or settled land at the time when it was peacefully annexed to the British dominations. The classification of the British acquisition of Australia as acquisition by settlement might therefore seem to be established, although it is possible that the question may be reopened in the High Court. 2 of the 4 justices in Coe v Commonwealth thought the point arguable, though 2 did not. Chief Justice Gibbs held that it is fundamental to our legal system that the Australian colonies became British possession by settlement and not by conquest. It is hardly necessary to say that the question is not how the manner in which Australia became a British possession might be appropriately described. For the purpose of deciding whether the common law was introduced into a newly acquired territory, a distinction was drawn between a colony acquired by conquest or cession, in which there was an established system of law of European type, and a colony colony acquired by settlement in a territory which, by European standards, had no civilized inhabitants or settled law. Australia has always been regarded as belonging to the latter class. On the other hand, Justice Jacobs pointed out that there was no Privy Council decision directly on the matter and that the plaintiff should be entitled to argue the point. Justice Murphy considered neither Cooper v. Stewart nor Millipram had settled the point. Although the Privy Council referred in Cooper v. Stewart to peaceful annexation, the Aboriginal people did not give up their land peacefully. They were killed or removed forcefully from their lands by United Kingdom's forces or the European colonialists in what amounted to attempted, and in Tasmania, almost complete genocide. The statement by the Privy Council may be regarded either as having been made in ignorance or as a convenient falsehood to justify the taking of Aboriginal people's land. Okay, we'll skip ahead a little bit. Cook's secret instructions had provided that he should acquire territory with the consent of the natives, but they also empowered him to take possession of uninhabited country by setting up proper markers and inscriptions as first discoverers and processors. According to Castles, each of the steps taken by Cook demonstrated that he was following those parts of his instructions which assumed that Australia was to be treated as uninhabited. Subsequent extension of the British rule were made, on the assumption that the entire continent were to be acquired through settlement and not conquest. The last lingering doubts, if there were any, were firmly removed when the British authorities refused to give any form of legal recognition to John Barman's claim that he could acquire land rights by treating with Aboriginal tribes in the Port Phillip district. So you see why I think regardless of who you are, when you see people celebrate the 26th of January and you hear anyone talk about the settlement of Australia, that's an admission of the land being stolen, because they're not meant to be able to settle if they're already people here. They have to take over the land by conquest or cession by the natives. And that's their rules. That's their standards they made up for themselves, the Europeans. And if you're of the same mindset as one of the justices said something along the lines of, by European standards, had no civilized inhabitants or settled law, you might want to check yourself for some white supremacy, because by quote-unquote European standards, shouldn't have they been able to just quote-unquote settle anywhere? And yeah, let's explore this terra nullius label. The audacity of saying that it's land that belongs to no one, when it's land that's had people on it for thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years. Can't really find that being said about other islands where the people have been there for a couple of hundred years. Interesting that. And another interesting thing is the size. So they've really been telling us for a couple hundred years now that the biggest island was nobody's. All the little ones might have been owned by someone, but the biggest one, with most likely the most people on it, that were there the longest, yet that's the one that belongs to no one. Why would it be like this? The British Empire went far and wide. They went to many islands, because we know that when Phillip got to Australia, that was 9 years after Cook died in Hawaii, so the British should have been aware of Hawaii. In theory, couldn't they have done the same thing on that island? It may not at first make sense why the biggest island that had the people on it the longest was the one that, terra nullius, until you remember that we were settled for convicts. And that's why at the start of the video I try to make the connection to the video I've made and uploaded twice now about prisons. And what do I mean? Well, when we think about this, imagine if Britain had a war of conquest just to secure land for prisoners. And also the legal side of it, to quote something from the earlier part of the video, the difference between the laws of the two kinds of colonies is that those of the former kind, all the English laws which are applicable to the colony are immediately enforced thereupon its foundation. So when you look at it from the angle of they were planning to make Australia Australia their prison, you can see why they wanted to make it legal by their standards for them to just get here and then their laws apply. Okay, the summary. The reason I would not celebrate January the 26th is because to me it really just represents the fact that the British Empire had a problem with wealth inequality and crime, so their prison system, imperialism and white supremacy, no doubt, caused them to go cause a genocide the other side of the world that people have lived on for fucking ever. No, not just lived on, have a connection with, and not just one group of people, this many groups of people, to make the law books work by their standards they've set up for themselves. They had to say that this was land that belonged to nobody. And so, to me, even just the word settlement for Australia has some horrid implications, and no matter who you are, where you are, we should all agree that there is no pride in genocide.